On November 25, 2025, Lee Soon-jae died at the age of 91. And the first thing that made the news feel so heavy was not only his age, but the illusion he had created over decades, that he would simply always be there. Not in the loud way of a star constantly chasing attention, but in the deeper way of someone who had become part of the emotional furniture of Korean screen culture itself. Korea Times reported that he died early that morning after health issues had worsened, while KBS said his agency identified pneumonia as the cause. Those details matter, but they are not what made the public reaction so immediate. What made it hurt was the shape of the loss. Lee Soon-jae was not a relic from a distant era who had already disappeared from view. He was still active almost until the end, still working, still spoken of in the present tense. That is why the news did not land like the closing of a long, expected chapter. It landed like a rupture in continuity. For generations of viewers, Lee Soon-jae had been more than an actor. He had been a constant, a face that could move between history, comedy, family drama, and national memory without ever feeling out of place. The idea that someone like that could suddenly stop existing in the living flow of Korean entertainment felt emotionally impossible for a moment, even after the facts were already clear. 2 days later, at Seoul Asan Medical Center, the grief took visible form. Yonhap and Korea Times reported that fellow actors gathered in tears for his funeral, where 91 flowers were placed on the coffin, one for each year of his life. Memorial speeches called him the nation's actor, and a pioneer whose influence reached almost every actor who came after him. That image, not the stage, not the camera, but the coffin, the flowers, the bowed heads of younger performers, is where this story has to begin. Because Lee Soon-jae's death was not mourned like the loss of one celebrity among many. It was mourned like the passing of a standard, a measuring line, a piece of the moral architecture of the craft itself. Even the posthumous awarding of the Gyeomgwan Order of Cultural Merit, the highest class of South Korean cultural decoration, reinforced that this was no ordinary farewell. The audience does not need a long list of his works yet to understand the scale of what was lost. The funeral already tells them. The tears of colleagues tell them. The 91 flowers tell them. Lee Soon-jae was the kind of man people assume will remain in the world simply because the world has looked more stable with him in it for so long. And that is why this opening feels so cruel. Before we go back to the young man stepping onto a stage in 1956, before the sitcom grandfather, the historical authority, the late-life accolades, and the final award, we begin here. With a country staring at a coffin and realizing that someone who had seemed woven into the continuity of Korean life had, at last, become memory. Long before Lee Soon-jae became the kind of presence Koreans treated as permanent, he was simply a young man moving through a country that was still rebuilding its own identity. He was born in Hyeong in 1934 and moved to Seoul as a child, which means his early life began in motion, before stability, before fame, before the idea that he would one day become part of Korea's emotional memory. The details of childhood are not the heart of this chapter. What matters is the direction of the young man he was becoming. He entered Seoul National University as a philosophy student, not as someone already polished into stardom. That fact matters because it tells you something about his mind before it tells you anything about his face. Lee Soon-jae did not begin as a celebrity looking for attention. He began as someone drawn toward thought, discipline, and seriousness, and then slowly toward performance. Korea Times notes that he graduated with a philosophy degree and made his stage debut in 1956 with Beyond the Horizon during his college years. What that means emotionally is even more important. Before he became a screen icon, he was a student who discovered that acting was not a distraction from life, but the form through which life might become most truthful. That beginning is why Lee Soon-jae's later legacy feels so different from ordinary stardom. He did not arrive through scandal, instant popularity, or one lucky screen break. He entered through theater, through rehearsal, through the demanding seriousness of performance before fame had fully industrialized itself. Reports on his early life after his death describe him as part of the original generation of Daehakuk, the student theater culture that helped shape modern Korean acting. In other words, he did not simply join an industry that already existed in mature form. He belonged to the generation that helped build its foundations. That is the emotional function of Part 2. The viewer should feel that Lee Soon-jae came from a harder, plainer era, one where acting still had to justify itself as art, and where a young man choosing the stage was not choosing glamour so much as commitment. Before the later warmth of sitcoms, before the authority of historical roles, before the tears at Asan Medical Center, there was a serious young man in Seoul stepping onto a stage in 1956 and beginning a life so long in performance that one country would eventually struggle to imagine itself. Without him, by the time Lee Soon-jae appeared in Unstoppable High Kick, in late 2006, he was already far beyond the point where anyone needed to prove he was a serious actor. That part of his life had been settled decades earlier. What no one expected was that a man already regarded as a veteran of Korean screen culture would suddenly become, once again, one of the most talked-about faces in the country, not through solemn prestige, but through comedy. That is what makes this chapter so important. High Kick did not introduce Lee Soon-jae to Korea. It reintroduced him to a generation that might have respected him from a distance, but had not yet folded him into everyday affection. The sitcom gave him a new kind of intimacy with the public. He played the stern patriarch of a chaotic family, a man who could be sharp, selfish, ridiculous, commanding, and unexpectedly lovable all at once. The brilliance of the performance was that he never chased the joke too hard. He stayed serious inside the absurdity, and that seriousness made the comedy land even harder. In one sense, this was a reinvention. In another, it was something deeper, proof that Lee Soon-jae's talent had never belonged to one era, one tone, or one category of acting. He could move from historical gravitas to household comedy without losing dignity, and that flexibility is exactly what made him feel less like a veteran star and more like a national constant. Korean reporting later described the show as a turning point that brought him extraordinary love from younger viewers, while historical summaries of the series note its huge ratings and broad cultural impact. What High Kick changed was not only his visibility, it changed his emotional relationship with the audience. Before that, Lee Soon-jae had often been admired in the way older actors are admired, with respect, with distance, with a sense of legacy. After High Kick, he became something much warmer and stranger, familiar. The show turned him into grandpa in a way that was affectionate rather than ceremonial. He was still authoritative, but he was now quotable, meme-worthy, and unexpectedly viral. One infamous comic moment from the series became so widely parodied that it generated the nickname Yadong Soon-jae, a bizarre and deeply modern kind of popularity that even he himself found surprising. Accounts of the period note that younger audiences who might never have followed his earlier work suddenly knew exactly who he was, and that even people close to him were startled by how much the sitcom expanded his reach. That is the emotional center of Part 3. High Kick was not just another successful role in a very long resume. It was the moment Lee Soon-jae stopped being only a legendary actor and became a living part of everyday popular culture for yet another generation. It proved that his presence was not historical in a dusty sense. It was active, elastic, and still capable of creating joy. And that is why this part has to feel so bright. The public was not merely watching an old master continue working. It was discovering, almost with delight, that he could still dominate the room in a completely different register. The sternness became comedy. The discipline became timing. The authority became warmth. By the end of this period, Lee Soon-jae no longer belonged only to critics, elders, or those who remembered the older decades of Korean television. He belonged to teenagers, families, late-night reruns, parody culture, and the kind of shared public memory that only happens when a performer is not just respected, but loved. That is what makes the later loss in Part 1 hit so hard. When Lee Soon-jae died, people were not only mourning a prestigious actor with a 70-year career, they were mourning someone whose face had already become woven into ordinary laughter, family routines, and the generational memory of home. What makes Lee Soon-jae's later years so moving is that there was no public fall in the usual sense. He was not a scandal-ridden veteran collapsing under the weight of his own legend. He was something rarer, and in a way more painful to watch, an actor whose body kept aging while his sense of duty to the craft refused to shrink with it. That is why King Lear matters so much in this part of the story. It is not just another title in a massive filmography. It is the right work for the right stage of his life. In 2023, Lee Soon-jae took on Shakespeare's Aging King at the LG Arts Center in Seoul, completing a 16-day run that the Korea Herald framed as both a performance and a testament to a 68-year acting career. On paper, the role already carried everything this chapter needed: old age, frailty, authority, rage, loss, the humiliation of physical decline, and the refusal to give up one's inner self even when the world begins to treat the body as finished. But what made it emotionally overwhelming was the overlap between role and actor. Watching Lee Soon-jae perform King Lear was not just watching a veteran actor play old age well. It was watching a man who had already outlived most of his contemporaries place his own life's gravity inside a character built from decay, pride, and the terrifying narrowing of time. That is the fracture in this story. Not moral collapse, not public disgrace, But the moment when the viewer begins to feel the distance between an immortal professional will and a mortal body that cannot keep pace forever. And yet even there, what defined Lee Soon-jae was not surrender, but resistance. Long before his death, he had spoken with unusual clarity about age and work. In a 2018 interview, he said he thought of every film and television project as if it might be his last, adding that he had no regrets because he had always known the work would never be easy. That line hits differently when you place it beside King Lear. It reveals that the fragility of his later years was never hidden from him. He knew exactly where he stood. He simply refused to let that knowledge reduce his seriousness. The fracture, then, was not that he was breaking internally. It was that time had finally begun pressing visibly against someone whose artistic discipline still felt unbroken. That is what makes this part more devastating than scandal ever could. A scandal can explain itself too quickly. Aging cannot. It is slow, dignified, humiliating, noble, and cruel all at once. With Lee Soon-jae, the public was not watching a man lose his passion. It was watching a master keep showing up even as the role itself, and life outside it, made the limits of age impossible to ignore. That is why this section must feel quieter and heavier than Part 3. High Kick made him beloved. King Lear made him vulnerable. It showed that the same actor who could still command a stage with almost frightening authority was already standing inside the reality every great performer eventually has to meet. The craft may remain limitless, but the body never does. And maybe that is the real crack in Lee Soon-jae's story. Not that he stopped being powerful, but that he kept being powerful long enough for the audience to finally see how much strength it costs to continue. What makes Lee Soon-jae's ending so emotionally overwhelming is that he did not leave the world as a man living only on memory. He left it while he was still proving that memory was not enough to define him. In January 2025, at the recorded broadcast of the 2024 KBS Drama Awards, Lee Soon-jae won the D-Song for Dog Knows Everything, becoming the oldest actor ever to receive the award. Korea Herald and Korea Times both noted the significance of the moment. This was not a Lifetime Achievement Consolation Prize disguised as relevance, but recognition for work he had done in the present tense, at 90, in a comedy drama that still placed him at the center. That detail matters more than any statistic. It means Lee Soon-jae did not spend his last chapter being politely honored for surviving long enough. He was still competing, still acting, still capable of carrying a project strongly enough for the industry to stop and say, "This man is still one of us, still active, still real." That is why his death later in November hit with such force. The public had only just watched him stand again, not as a relic of old Korean television, but as a living artist receiving the country's top drama award. That image changed the shape of the loss. He was not someone the audience had already placed in the past. He was still walking toward tomorrow when tomorrow suddenly closed. And then came the funeral, where all the emotional logic of his career collapsed into one unbearable image. The man so many people had assumed would always remain somewhere in Korean life was now being carried out in silence. At Seoul Asan Medical Center, colleagues, students, and fellow actors gathered to say goodbye. Yonhap and Korea Times reported that mourners laid 91 flowers on the coffin, one for every year of his life, while memorial speeches called him the nation's actor and a pioneer who had shaped generations of performers. Actress Ha Ji-won remembered him as a true artist, and the mourning itself felt unusually revealing. People were not only praising his career, they were describing the standard he had set: humility, seriousness, discipline, and the strange warmth that made him feel both larger than life and deeply familiar. Even the burial arrangements reinforced the finality of it. After the service in Seoul, local reports said he would be laid to rest at Eden Paradise in Incheon. This is where the story must end. Not with a long resume, not with a list of titles, but with the recognition that Lee Soon-jae represented something increasingly rare. A performer who lived so long, worked so steadily, and crossed so many eras that the public stopped experiencing him as one actor and began experiencing him almost as a condition of cultural continuity itself. When someone like that dies, what remains is not just tribute. It is disorientation. Korea still has the dramas, the sitcom reruns, the stage history, the award speech, and the image of him smiling through one more victory. But the man who held all of that together is gone. And maybe that is the final ache of Lee Soon-jae's story. He spent nearly 70 years teaching a country what endurance in art could look like, and in the end, even that endurance had to stop somewhere. The work remained. The standard remained. But for the first time in generations, Lee Soon-jae did not.